Welcome, my name is Mary Reed and I'm the Director-Curator of the Woodstock Art Gallery. I'm happy to introduce two extraordinary practitioners of abstraction, Ron Shuebrook and Frances Thomas. Ron Shuebrook is an artist, educator, and a professor emeritus at OCAD, Ontario College of Art and Design University, where he was the president from 2000 to 2005 and vice president academic from 1998 to 2002. In 2008, he was awarded a Doctor of Fine Arts honoris causa for his contributions to art and education. Shuebrook has been on faculty and an administrator at 6 other Canadian educational institutions, including the University of Guelph from 1988 to 1998, where he served as professor and chair of the Department of Fine Art and helped establish the MFA program in studio art in 1992. Since 1965, Shuebrook has had more than 100 solo exhibitions and has participated in more than 200 group exhibitions. His works are included in more than 60 public and corporate collections, such as the National Gallery of Canada, the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, and our very own Woodstock Art Gallery. Ron Shuebrook lives in Guelph, Ontario, and also splits his time in Blandford, Nova Scotia. He has been represented by the Olga Corporate Gallery in Toronto since 1979. Frances Thomas is a painter and printmaker who was born in Parry Sound, Ontario. She has exhibited in Barrie, Montreal, Edmonton, Toronto, and New York, and her work is in the permanent collections of the McLaren Art Centre, the Bank of Montreal, and York University, and most recently has been added to the Woodstock Art Gallery's permanent collection. Thomas has taught at Georgian College, as well as holding advisory positions on various fine art committees at Georgian. Frances currently lives and works in Barrie, Ontario, and she's also the curator of the permanent art collection at the Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre, RVH, in Barrie. Her work is represented by the Peter Robinson Gallery in Edmonton, Alberta. I have personally known both of these artists for most of my adult life, and this exhibition has been a real labor of love. I want to deeply and sincerely thank both Frances and Ron for your steadfast support and enthusiasm for this project. This whole exhibition project concept started as a conversation on abstract painting that we hope to capture here. Can you each describe your painting practice as it evolved into abstraction? Frances, we'll start with you. We'll pass it over to Ron.
Sure. Well, it's taken me a long time to figure things out. You'll hear me get quite personal, and it's because I want to put a crack in the fourth wall. We live on the surface of things too much, in my view, and this is to our own detriment, and the cost is evident in our current post-truth era. I want authenticity, and that demands vulnerability. So I didn't grow up in a family that looked at art or knew what art was. My first exposure to what many would have considered art was in my childhood home in the single image that had pride of place above our living room couch. It was a large reproduction of a painting of a barn in the woods and a piece of decor with a high gloss surface that seemed to give it even more presence. I was born and raised in Parry Sound, as Mary mentioned, in a middle-class family by parents that never finished school, having opted, as many did in the late 1930s and early 1940s, for employment over education. There was no art program in my public school, nor access to museums or galleries. I lived day in and day out as a wild child on the shores of Georgian Bay and as a frightened, obedient daughter in a rural-laden home the rest of the time. In the later 1970s, I had the good fortune to stumble upon a drawing class in Parry Sound taught by Bert Weir, a graduate of OCA as it then was. Bert introduced me to automatic drawing, and he used terms like personal vision. I could not have known how transformative that time would be, spending all those hours drawing in the barn-like building once home to the Pentecostal church and turned motorcycle repair shop, later renovated by Bert and his wife and situated near the tracks near downtown. That class, along with personal revelations about how I wanted to live my life, precipitated my divorce in 1978 and the subsequent decision to go to Europe. I was in the museums of Europe from 1979 to 1981, where I discovered great modern and contemporary art and architecture. Who knew Da Vinci's Mona Lisa was so small, or that Rembrandt's Night Watch was so big? That was a shock. When I returned to Canada from Europe, there were a few more hiccups, read second marriage and divorce, before I made my way to York University's BFA program in 1992. One of the revelations I had about my life and progress as an artist came by way of Emily McKibben's beautiful essay about our intersecting lives, titled Light and Shadow, One Painting, Two Lives, and published in the Malahat Review. Emily writes, Simone de Beauvoir describes how writers Virginia Woolf, George Eliot, and the Bronte sisters had to expend, quote, so much negative energy freeing themselves from external constraints that they arrived out of breath at the point where the major masculine writers were starting out. And out of breath, I arrived at York University. Nonetheless, I was like a sponge in the library art history stacks, reading about the German abstract painter Blinky Palermo, the automatistes Kandinsky, Jackson Pollock, Helen Frankenthaler, Agnes Martin, Paul Klee, Louise Bourgeois, Cy Twombly, Linda Benglis, and so many others. There were also books and journals I discovered on philosophy and phenomenology. I became intrigued by the proposition that the essence of something can come through another form of expression, something known through the senses rather than thought. And it unlocked for me what has become a lifelong interest in the exploration of ideas. Post-BFA, I had a large studio in a 3-room schoolhouse in Honeywood, Ontario, on the Niagara Escarpment. During that period, I often did paintings of the landscape, which is a beginning, if not ongoing, interest for many artists. I think it had more to do with me wanting to be in nature, actually. One day, I was on a side road with the most beautiful vista in front of me. I started a more or less representational image. As the piece progressed, I became excited about the emerging shapes, colors, and relationships. I stopped at some point to reflect on the work and got a shock when I discovered that there was no horizon line. Intuitively, I had left it out and allowed a speculative image to arise that spoke to something otherworldly, something strange, spiritual even, and not much connected to ordinary things. Though I didn't know then why or what I had done, I did know it felt exhilarating and that I was invested in much more than the thing, the landscape. In 2003, I was invited to an artist residency in Pooch Cove, Newfoundland. It is a landscape that haunts me still. It wasn't just that I was standing on the edge of Canada, I felt like I was standing on a psychic edge. That was followed in 2004 by acceptance to Triangle, an artist residency in Dumbo, New York. It was a powerful time of removing myself from the day-to-day and being able to simply follow my attention and engage in a deeper process. There were 30 of us from around the world, and for 2 weeks we worked and exchanged life stories and ideas and interacted with art critics and other arts professionals. It was another 9 years before I applied and was accepted into the MFA program at York University. That decision had everything to do with wanting to challenge myself as an artist and deepen my practice, and that time did not disappoint. During my years at York University, I was very lucky to have Tim Whiten as a teacher and mentor, and we share a friendship to this day, which I cherish. His celebrated works engage with ritual, myth, and alchemy in his exploration of the depths of human experience. Our conversations have doubtless influenced my ongoing interest and investigation into personal experience and how it functions as a solid theoretical grounding within contemporary art discourse. Each work I do is research about existence. In 2016, a year after my MFA graduation, I had a wonderful opportunity for a 3-month self-directed artist residency in a studio in Berlin. By this time, experimentation and process were foundational procedures for me, and I continued to build my personal language of form and color. Berlin was formative as well, given how entrenched I was in abstraction and the opportunity to see museum shows of leading abstractionists like Julie Moretu and Amy Silman. Abstraction has been a long and fervent study for me. I use it, among other things, to explore human vulnerability and to try to express something urgent. It isn't so much about self-exposure, but connection. The work is never solely about the author. I am interested in images that are unhinged from a one-to-one representation of things in the real object world. Freedom and experimentation are fundamental generative motivations for me. I mention freedom because it is one of the most seductive things for me about abstraction. Like life itself, I am incapable of staying still. Change is life, and that captures an essential truth about my art and about human existence, and that plays into my approach of art making. Abstraction for me isn't an esoteric form, but is relational. It is a practice that demands a different kind of attention and a different kind of thinking, and the dynamism of abstraction parallels life's ever-changing complexities. The work is a visualization of my reflections and is a gesture of communication. I proceed more from images and feelings rather than a coherent linear path from artwork to artwork. It is what I have called the consistency of my inconsistency. An intensely lived life can only be remembered, recalled, and imagined in scattered fragments. I'm not interested in offering a literal record of events. I believe in the imaginative translation of things, that fiction gets closer to the truth of things. It takes a poetic imagination to make visible a deeper layer of truth. For me, abstraction allows for an open process of interpretation, and where you end up is not guaranteed, and not where any other viewer might end up. As well, days or weeks later, you can come away with a different or renewed interpretation. Abstraction lends itself to a more unstructured means of understanding and to more fully engage subjectivity. Tracy Emin said, and I quote, "For years it was out of favor to have emotion, an underlying subject of my work, in art. However, it is no longer condescendingly dismissed as female." I do risk incoherency in the service of the arising image. It puts my work in jeopardy because I'm denying definition and tidy resolution. I'm not intentionally being obscure, but work to open a space for the paint and me to hopefully conjure something revelatory. I'm using form and structure to image something deeper than self, deeper than life. The beauty of abstraction is the ability to catch a feeling rather than a particular form. It isn't about detail, but more about gesture, about distillation. Painting is not separate from life, it is one.
Thank you so much for that, Frances. So I turn it over to you, Ron, and again pose the same question to talk about how your painting practice evolved into abstraction.
Fundamental to the early development of my abilities in the visual art was the specialist art instruction that was available through the primary and secondary levels in Pennsylvania public schools where I grew up. In addition, I was inspired by visits to the Philadelphia Museum, where I had stimulating encounters with European art by such consequential artists as Cézanne, Picasso, Matisse, Mondrian, Duchamp, and Brancusi, as well as with American artists such as Thomas Eakins, Stuart Davis, and Andrew Wyeth. On the other hand, in our working class home, there were no paintings and few books, and not even a public library nearby. During my undergraduate studies in art education at Kutztown State College from 1961 through 65, I gained a broad familiarity with modern European and American painting that ranged from realism to impressionism and post-impressionism through early abstraction. I also learned about the then, still, in my circumstance, controversial abstract expressionist painters, and on a trip to New York City, I finally experienced firsthand impressive works by those influential artists. With the Vietnam War underway, I received my draft notice in spring of 1965. Fortunately, I had already received a summer scholarship to Haystack Mountain School of Crafts in Deer Isle, Maine, where I looked forward to studying with William Holst, Holst, a dedicated abstract painter and former student of Hans Hofmann, and Morton Grossman, a sensitive painter of color abstractions. To my relief, my induction into the Army was deferred until the end of the summer, and I was able to continue my studio education at Haystack. Thanks to Bill's and Mort's expert knowledge and empathetic instruction, I began to more fully understand the expressive necessities of rigorous pictorial form and structure, and became more conscious of the evocative and structural roles of color in the construction of space, movement, and meaning. I also deepened my respect for and interest in various craft disciplines, and was inspired by the presence of M.C. Richards, Mary Caroline Richards, a visionary educator, poet, and educational theorist, as well as the author of a very influential book at the time entitled Centering. These life-changing experiences inspired a group of black and white abstract drawings, initially in response to my observations of the Maine landscape, and soon became increasingly independent from representation as I explored the interaction of, quote, positive, end quote, and negative spaces, end quote. In the autumn of 1965, I was inducted into the U.S. Army, was eventually posted to Germany, and while on the way to Europe, visited galleries in New York City, where I first saw the sublime paintings of Barnett Newman. While being stationed near Nuremberg in December 1966, I traveled to London, where I was greatly inspired by a room of Mark Rothko's transcendent canvases at the Tate. Following my Army discharge in the summer of '67, I returned to Haystack, where I served as a studio monitor and studied with the British designer artist Peter G., whose strategic approaches to color theory and contemporary materials were stimulating, and also persuaded me to examine the ideas of relevant critical theorists and artists. By the fall, I had a solo exhibition of abstract drawings at a commercial gallery near Philadelphia. In contrast, I was profoundly distressed by the horrors of the Vietnam War, the rampant racism and social injustices, and felt an intense need to find ways to contribute explicitly to positive social change. Consequently, I became a social worker with child welfare in Wilmington, Delaware, right about the time that Joe Biden was emerging in the political sphere in the same city. Nevertheless, on weekends, I traveled to New York City to work as a studio assistant for Peter G. and to visit galleries and museums. Fortunately, I also possessed the stamina to persevere with my creative work and began to better comprehend the rigors of serious abstraction. At the time, my most crucial influences were Hans Hofmann, Barnett Newman, and Robert Motherwell, while I also became familiar with the systematic planning and restrained execution evident in the paintings of Al Held, Jack Youngerman, and Frank Stella. Based on these studies and experiences with historic and contemporary art and artists, as well as on my own subjective curiosities and temperament, I felt ready to concentrate on my investigations of abstraction and came to understand that color was fundamental to pictorial structure and psychological evocation. The significant formal innovations of Cézanne, Matisse, Mondrian, and Hans Hofmann profoundly influenced my explorations. The achievements and contributions of those remarkable artists were essential to my understandings of aesthetic form, and they continue to be profoundly relevant to my ongoing explorations and practices as an abstract and non-objective painter. I insert that, I have to comment, that term is hardly used these days. Consequently, I would like to share the following brief commentaries on those remarkable earlier artists who, in my view, were crucial to our conscious understandings, at least my understanding, of significant aspects of the structural foundations of pictorial form. To me, Paul Cézanne understood the potential of a painting to embody its own inherent order. Although his art was inspired by his observations and his little sensations of the world, as well as certain historical precedents, his mature paintings exist as separate, though equivalent, expressive realities. For instance, in his paintings of Mont Saint-Victoire, Cézanne employed the elements of colored planes and contrasting lines to serve, employed the elements of colored planes and contrasting lines to serve as common denominators derived from the observed landscape that visually integrate different literal objects and subjects into sensitive orchestrations of painted images and movements. Recalling the specificities of seen places and things, Cézanne's compelling paintings possess an inner necessity that invites the viewer's careful scrutiny of their shimmering surfaces and fluid constructed spaces. As well, Henri Matisse recognized painting as a vehicle to investigate the optical and psychological tensions that were possible between the physical facts of the picture plane and the perceived spatial properties of color. Always sensitive to the potential of the interaction of colors to evoke light, Matisse was also capable of employing contrasting hues and tones, saturations and intensities, and atmospheric passages and solid surfaces in the purposeful construction of images of disarming beauty and emotional complexity. In addition, he often tested the poetry of elegant simplicity, while in other instances, he considered the juxtaposition of complicated patterns and structures derived from the observed domestic environment. Later in life, when illness threatened to disrupt his manual dexterity, Matisse created an innovative series of collages of painted and cut papers that ranged from abstracted representations of the figure to non-objective integrations of structural color and emotive shapes. In the case of Piet Mondrian, his apparently logical yet daring deductions initially seemed to be cerebral investigations into a former order disconnected from the experience of the world. Yet Mondrian, too, began his creative journey with careful scrutiny of the external world and its metaphysical propositions. His early light-filled landscapes are characterized by color relationships and organic structures that are coherent and refreshing gifts to the viewer. As his search for wholeness proceeded, Mondrian eventually understood the significance of the perceived spaces between literal things. This epiphany led him to the consideration of possible congruence and interactions between pictorial intervals, planes of specific colors, and the actuality of the physical canvas. These investigations sought to reconcile pictorial incident through a system of constants and variables. Much later, while living in New York City, he allowed the cultural rhythms and colors of urban existence to enter his paintings. His embrace of new experiences and acceptance of these seemingly contradictory impulses reinforce, for me, the potential that art making must always be open to reconsiderations and renewals. Finally, Hans Hofmann has served me as a valuable model of an authentic artist teacher who was capable of simultaneously exploring various modes and processes of abstract and non-objective painting. His empathetic and generous belief that there were an almost infinite number of valid sources for art making has been a pertinent model for my own approaches to studio pedagogy. Moreover, Hofmann also offered me, as he did for many of my teachers and mentors, stimulating theories of dynamic formal construction based largely on the expressive interaction of color and its inherent techniques that he explored throughout his career were persuasive precedents for many other significant modernist painters whom I admire and have been instructive catalysts for my own sustained and purposeful investigations. For me, Hans Hofmann's theories and paintings continue to be profoundly instructive in relation to the diverse possibilities of abstraction and non-objective art that can be generated through the integration of conscious and intuitive means.
Thank you so much for that, Ron. That's wonderful. The next question, I'm going to be turning it over to Frances. In Frances's former studio, this painting, Midnight Rainbow, hung below the following quote written in Thomas's beautiful looping script. The whole business of painting is very much to do with forgetting myself and being able to act instinctively. Written by German-British artist Frank Orbach. I would like Frances now, can you please expand on the significance of this quote?
Orbach, the painter's painter. Another of his comments is to the effect of, quote, if something looks like a painting, it does not look like an experience. I think a good painting concentrates the experience of being. One can only aspire to the brilliance of an Orbach, but I like to think that what I'm attempting above all else is to be as real as possible, to get out of my head, read, forget oneself, and go into the void, that place which is bigger than us, and bring something back. In the service of that idea of going somewhere and bringing something back, I might mention here an influential book that I've been reading and rereading over the last couple of years called The Great Image Has No Form, or The Non-Objective Through Painting by François Julien. When it feels like you have been stumbling around in the dark for a very long time, it is heartening to read a thesis that is so aligned with how you perceive you've been functioning all along. Julien is interested in decentralizing Western foundational thought set down by Greece and to, quote, respond to the dilemma of the desire to constitute a this, end of quote. A this, which is an attempt to isolate and define versus reflecting on the seduction and richness of ambiguity. It is affirming to read about approaches to form that align so closely with my intent, namely grasping the world beyond reason, beyond the surface of things, thus giving up the power of description. It is significant to me to stay connected to a deep force, or what might be called the source of all things, and for the form to resist being a fixed, airless thing without spirit. To resist the force of rational thought is extremely difficult. However, the desire to forego distinctions and choose ambiance, the desire to wrestle with a form that refuses to disconnect itself from the beyond, is infinitely compelling. It demands a letting go and seeking, and in Julien's words, quote, to grasp forms and things surging up and fading away at the same time. In the end, I am a product of Western thought and academia, and at the same time I seek to resist that when I'm in the studio, for it does not serve me well there. It informs me certainly, but gets in the way of me painting. Again, in Julien's words, something with a, quote, as if there were not, end of quote, quality. To get out of my way is to grant myself access to what things might be in themselves, their essence. I can see references to landscape in Midnight Rainbows, but it doesn't feel like a structured world serving as a framework for specification, but rather a space open to disclosure or an epiphany. I think Midnight Rainbow is a good example of my attempts to get out of my own way and grasp the world beyond its distinctive features and lean more into some sort of essential transition or movement versus immobilization and categorization. Materially, it is also fluid with an acrylic stain brushed across the surface, overlaid with hard-body floating forms. There is a quality of something that is and something that is not, communicating on a fundamental level, neither negating the other. When thinking about Mary's question and looking at this painting again, the word mutability came to mind. I then remembered that I quoted Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem, Mutability, We Are as Clouds That Veil the Midnight Moon, in my MFA thesis in 2016. Foregoing reading the whole poem, I will quote the final stanza, as I feel it is immensely suited to what I have been saying and the tone of this painting. It is the same, for be it joy or sorrow, the path of its departure still is free.
Man's yesterday may ne'er be like his morrow. Naught may endure but mutability.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing us with this, Frances.
Ron, a number of the works in the exhibition are in response to the built environment, at a time referencing current tragic events, such as Untitled Contested Territories, #2. You also split your time between your studio at the Boarding House Arts in Guelph and your studio on the Atlantic Ocean in Blandford on Shoal Cove, which is part of Mahone Bay. Can you please speak about how various external influences impact your painting?
I strive to be critically conscious of our time, of my observed and felt environment, and our historical context. Thus, my contested territory paintings seek to embody, pictorially, competing philosophical and ethical values, socio-political circumstances, psychological and spiritual states, and various visual tensions that trouble our era. Throughout my career, I have felt an urgent need to explore the potential for the visual and physical structure in my art to exemplify philosophic or social meaning. For instance, since early adolescence, I have read and reread Herman Melville's epic novel, Moby Dick. Over the decades, my maturing attention to that complicated text has uncovered multi-layered references, diverse human relationships, and an innovative allegory that contains profound human insights and poignant references. In chapter 72 of The Monkey Rope, I was deeply moved by the narrator's description of the use of what is called, in whaling practices, a monkey rope. It's a length of rope wrapped around the waist of the harpooner for safety when he's lowered 10 or so feet over the side of the ship to attend to the whale. Unlike the organ grinder's monkey rope for which it's named, the whaling version has the other end tied to the waist of his bowsman, who remains on deck. Thus bound, the two men know that they are completely interdependent on each other for survival. If one goes into the sea, the other will be dragged overboard in his wake. Melville's narrator, Ishmael, the bowsman, articulates the metaphysical implications of this relationship as follows. I saw that this situation of mine was the precise situation of every mortal that breathes. Only in most cases, he has this connection with a plurality of other mortals. The mental image I formed of the rope that twined itself around each of these human beings inspired me to create a metaphor for the intrinsically interdependent relationships between people. This monkey rope configuration has appeared in much of my visual art over the last 15 years or so, including a painting called Ishmael's Lament from 2005, which contains a tense visual equivalent to the similarities and differences among people, and symbolizes the contingent interconnectedness of human beings in society when they're working collectively toward common goals. As I was approaching retirement from teaching in the spring of 2008, I created the monumental acrylic painting Dark Spring as a personal commemoration of the murders and wounding of students at Kent State University on May 4th, 1970. That was the final tragic catalyst for my decision to leave the United States and to emigrate to Canada, where I am now a citizen. As a kind of compendium of almost every aspect of the painterly vocabulary that I had accumulated over my career, including fragments of the monkey rope, Dark Spring was also intended to be psychologically sober, pictorially urgent, and formally complex, while evoking a sense of tragedy and loss through abstract means, without employing overt representation. More recently, in 2018, I was moved to create a series of small compositions that were distilled responses to the horrors of the deadly Grenfell Tower fire of 2017 in London, UK. Attributed to corporate greed that irresponsibly directed the use of substandard materials in the construction of that residence building, This shocking event compelled me to re-examine the parameters of my practice and led me to employ mediated imagery from the internet as sources for the almost explicit representational imagery included in these paintings. My hope is that these small black, white, and gray compositions are sufficiently compelling to serve as urgent reminders of that disturbing human tragedy as they pictorially integrate aspects of both representation and abstraction.
Thank you, Ron. That's very, very moving. In one of our exchanges while planning this exhibition, Frances, you posed the question, why am I choosing to paint? Could you take the opportunity to talk about the materiality and magic of painting and perhaps touch upon how you were able to transform the inspiration you find in the natural world in your painting practice?
I remember having to answer that question about why I paint when I was doing my undergrad at York University in the 1990s. Unbeknownst to me, I was entering the rarefied space of all things conceptual and the sphere of French theorists. My first day in the painting studio, I had a canvas set up on an easel, as did the rest of the class, and the professor walked up to me and bluntly asked, "Why are you painting?" It pretty much undid my fragile self. That person that thought the only thing artists did was paint. That person who never heard of art history, art theory, or conceptual art. Over the course of those 4 years, I dug deep, ultimately reaffirming for myself what paint can do that no other medium can. As physical beings, I think we are susceptible or predisposed to materiality. But contemporary paint isn't just any material. This viscous and yes, plastic matter has a particular responsiveness to manipulation and an unparalleled expressive potential, not to mention incredible chromatic qualities. I'm a drawer in paint and find that paint is an unsurpassed tool to express the sensorium of lived experience. I graduated from my BFA as a painter, and 17 years later, I graduated from my MFA as a painter. Recently, scientists discovered what they believe to be the world's oldest artwork, depicting 3 people gathered around a large red pig in a cave on an Indonesian island. Whoever made that painting certainly wasn't making it as art. But what is fascinating to me is that someone made a form on a cave wall from colored matter 51,200 years ago. So in addition to what I've already mentioned in terms of why I choose to paint, I believe it is connected to the motivation behind the activity on that island all those millennia ago. What it tells me is that I share with those long ago beings the enchantment of making an image with some form of fluid matter on a flat surface, that this act of creativity and image making is somehow life-affirming. Critical to how I make a painting is process. I'm in search of form, but form that is not still. I'm in search of an image, but not just any image. It is why I don't use overt references to the real object world, which for me is confining and drives the work, rather than my imagination and intuition driving the work. My art can be characterized as spontaneous, while at the same time it is intentional. In the end, I look for beauty, although it is delivered often unconventionally. It needs to arrive without me noticing. And I look for poetry, and I look to be surprised. I think it is unavoidable that there is no denying humanity's deep and inescapable connection to the natural world. Suzanne Fracon said it well. Her work features massive volumes of bright, solid hues. Yet the artist insists her works are packed with content, noting that landscape, architecture, human beings and their consciousness, it is all there, but it's not a depiction. During my MFA defense, I was asked what my subject matter was, and I quipped back, do we even use that term anymore as it relates to abstraction? Believing then, as I do now, that it is impossible in abstraction to separate out subject matter from form and material. It is all integrated, from the little girl running across the rocks on the islands of Georgian Bay up to and including this very moment, everything I have seen, heard, done, and lost. It is simply everything, and it is viscerally embedded in the flow and material of the work. Thinking about the part of the question of how I might transform the inspiration I find in the natural world, I guess I can't separate that out, the natural world part. I need to expand that to include the unnatural world, which I would characterize as the Anthropocene, the epoch we are now living in. And I'm going to pluralize world to worlds. And I'm going to add everything perceived and not perceived. Now we are getting closer to what inspires, engages, and stimulates me as the generative matter for transformation. Like every other human, I absorb things constantly, and though I stand in awe of nature, no sunset or flower is going to make me dash to the studio to paint it. I don't go to the studio with an idea and then attempt to realize that idea. I show up, fuss around, maybe read, put some materials out, and start painting. It is then that what we might call inspiration happens, during the process of painting. An instinct or compulsion takes over. It is energizing and directs me. I feel blind and all-seeing in the same moment, one move directing the next, and with no assurance of success, other than a deep trust in the process and that where I'm headed is meaningful. I'm going to go on a side tangent and answer a question that you haven't even had a chance to ask. But it is what I get a lot, and I think it relates to the notion of inspiration. The question I'm asked is, how do you know when the painting is finished? During the process of painting, there's a back and forth between me and the painting. Most often I will do a painting in one session. And a session can be several hours in the studio on one day, or several hours over consecutive days, where I'm careful to keep myself contained at home and withdraw from my social life as much as possible, so I don't lose the thread binding me to what is happening and emerging in the studio. As I work on the painting, at every stage during its development, I feel a persistent agitation inside of me and in the work, an uncomfortable feeling that something is missing or unresolved. I just know something isn't right yet. And if I'm lucky and have stayed connected to what is happening to me, in me and the work, a moment will arrive when the painting has found its identity, or there is a congruence that makes sense to me. It feels complete, but complete only in the sense of a chapter in a book, a standalone image in a long line of images still to be done. For me, being inspired has no conclusion. It is a state of action. I know that the language of abstraction is difficult. How can a bunch of lines and shapes and color mean something? Charlene von Hale says that she seeks to establish a, quote, relationship of now, end of quote, that the viewer is, quote, actually in the moment in front of a painting and something happens, end of quote. That is my greatest hope, that a viewer will remain curious, will stand in the present moment and not immediately default to trying to find recognizable things, but open themselves to the mystery and forces that dance before them, be seized, if you will, and let my unconscious speak to their unconscious. In the end, I believe that a good abstract painting, whatever its motivation, will never be fully understood. That's the exciting part. It keeps itself open.
As we were planning this exhibition, there's been quite a bit of a discussion around the concept of significant form articulated by Clive Bell and Roger Fry over 100 years ago. Further to this, Ron, in a 2013 interview with critic Robert Enright, you cheekily commented, "If I work with a rectangle, I always restate the rectangle. I also might deny it." Ron, can you please discuss what significant form means to you and how it manifests in your work?
The fact that I still use that term, which I still believe in. My understanding of significant form and expressive formal structure in general developed slowly through many years of study and practice, as well as from my firsthand experiences with great art and artists. The desire to create rigorous visual art has become fundamental to my extended creative pursuits, primarily of abstract and non-objective drawing and painting, for more than a half century. As well It is important to note that my broad undergraduate art education at Kutztown State College included conventional courses in color and design foundations, numerous studio disciplines, art history, aesthetics, educational theories and methods, and complementary areas of the liberal arts and sciences. In class lectures and assigned readings, I became aware of certain philosophies of art and aesthetics, as well as a limited selection of learning theories and historical approaches to art criticism and interpretation. I rarely read primary art texts, except for those suggested by my studio professors. That included Robert Henry's Art Spirit, Ben Shaw's Shape of Content, and Hans Hofmann's Search for the Real. On the other hand, I enthusiastically followed recommendations from my trusted friends concerning literature, music, and politics. Following my military service in 1967 and a year as a social worker, I began a master's degree in art education at what was then Kutztown University, and taught art full-time in an inner-city middle school in Reading, Pennsylvania, in a neighborhood that John Updike used to write about. As I immersed myself in my new teaching responsibilities and the intense requirements of graduate studies, I was determined to think more critically about my future and read key sources relevant to becoming a serious artist educator. Not only did I read valuable essays on contemporary culture, but I also encountered certain pertinent writings by Roger Fry, Martin Buber, and Clement Greenberg that compelled me to deepen my understanding of aesthetic form. I also became more conscious of the critical imperatives that influenced the creative ambitions of many of my admired contemporaries. From the fall of '69 to the summer of 1970, I had a painting fellowship at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts, where I was privileged to be mentored by such perceptive abstract painters as Myron Stout and Fritz Bultmann, close associates of Hans Hofmann. I don't think very many Canadians know who those artists were. I also benefited from contacts with such influential artists as Robert Motherwell, Jack Tworkov, Alan Capral, and others. For the first time in my life, I was immersed in a community in which the practice of art in diverse disciplines was taken very seriously and was fundamental to the daily thoughts and actions of many of the extraordinary people who I encountered regularly. Walking by Hans Hofmann's house on Commercial Street, or passing the boat shed that had once served Franz Klein as a studio, also provided vital evidence that art making had a history in that town. Moreover, having received the fellowship from the Work Center based on the promise of my talent rather than really extended accomplishment, it seemed to be an invitation to commit myself to a creative life. Moreover, every time I encountered a significant writer or artist, such as Mary Oliver or Motherwell or Carl Knatz on the street, at the Art Association, or in a shop, I was inspired further. Being immersed in such a stimulating cultural environment convinced me that the creation of authentic art required a finely honed visual intelligence, critical judgment, a devotion to hard work, and a dedication to an unending search for an art of purpose and meaning. When I was offered a teaching assistantship and tuition waiver to pursue an MFA at Kent State, I enthusiastically pursued my further graduate studies that included studio practices in painting, drawing, printmaking, and sculpture, as well as various courses in European and American art history. In addition, I engaged in independent study and research in Canadian art under the congenial supervision of an art history professor whose doctoral dissertation was on expatriate American artists such as Benjamin West and John Singleton Copley, who achieved distinguished careers in Britain in the 18th and 19th century. Furthermore, I completed graduate courses in modern and contemporary literature and value theory. Simultaneously, over my 2 years in Ohio, I taught 2 levels of life drawing at Kent State and offered various courses in art, photography, and filmmaking for a range of students, from preschool children through adults in community education programs, at the nearby Canton Art Institute and the Akron Art Institute. As well, I was privileged to serve on the School of Art's Gallery Committee and met with and was influenced by the innovative, still then emerging artists Linda Benglis and Dorothea Rockburn when they exhibited at Kent. As well, I was also awarded a scholarship for the Blossom Kent Summer Program, during which I was briefly advised and encouraged by the renowned representational painters Ron Kitai and Leon Golub, as I was by each of my Kent professors, including my always encouraging thesis advisor, Mort Grossman. I greatly admired Mort's sensitive abstractions that were derived from his observations from nature and then transformed into inventive orchestrations of subtle gestures and translucent color. Inspired by these many and diverse historic and contemporary artists of integrity, I believe deeply that the interrelationships of the pictorial elements and physical materials that constitute significant form is what separates works of visual art from other more prosaic objects in the world. I've come to be convinced that aesthetic integrity in a work of art requires an aspiration to make every aspect in its character matter in its final state. For me, it is almost an ethical responsibility to strive to integrate every aspect of composition into a causal whole. Every mark, line, plane, edge, surface, hue, tone, gesture, and process must be necessary and must interact to construct the aesthetic specificity of the object of contemplation, whether it evokes an experience of pictorial harmony, of spatial ambiguity, or directional tension. I also now believe that there are countless sources, subject matters, and contents that are legitimate catalysts for art making, and that when expressively required, these diverse motivations, objectives, and factors may exist simultaneously in a dynamic perceptual presence. As I persevere with my studio practices in my remaining senior years, I will strive to be open to new opportunities and expect that my commitment to expressive form in my art will be sustained.
In addition to both being gifted artists, you are both exceedingly generous educators. Can you talk about this dual role of educator and artist and how it has influenced your approach to art making?
The act of teaching can be a source of inspiration, and the artist's experience and own creative endeavors can provide real-world examples and inspiration for their teaching. Personally, I'm not interested in using my creativity, hard-won wisdom, and skill set just to make art to exhibit and sell. Canadian painter Harold Clunder once said to me, "I don't know how anyone survives that isn't an artist." He was referring to the powerful benefits emotionally and psychologically of being creative. My discoveries and experience as a maker over all these years have influenced my role as an educator. I truly believe that creativity is not only a fundamental part of being human, but that it is necessary for our development and well-being, and it is that mindset that I bring to my teaching. Over many years, I have taught at a variety of institutions and organizations, including Georgian College, York University, Hope Acres Treatment Center, public galleries, including the McLaren Arts Center, as well as at Royal Victoria Regional Health Center in Barrie. Depending on what criteria I had to meet, I have taught everything from formal art making skills and professional practice to a one-on-one with a young girl in RVH's mental health inpatient unit who is at risk of suicide. In the end, for me, it all comes down to one thing as an educator, and that is to help someone use the thing we all have, meaning the desire to express oneself and to do it as authentically as possible. In one of the didactic panels in the exhibition, Mary has provided a statement I sent to her that includes a quote from Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset. He proposed that we focus on the only truthful reality, my life, the life of the individual. Reality is not outside of the subject. He believed that a life cannot be detached from one's circumstances nor from objects, and it led to his famous maxim, Yo soy yo y mi circunstancia. I am I, and my circumstance. Further, he denounced a life of convention and given structures, saying that we must be active, decide, and create a project of life. There is something to be said about art and creativity as self-discovery, and if we are brave enough to dig deep, it leads to a deeper understanding of the human condition, and in turn, the ability to touch others in meaningful ways.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Frances, for that. Ron, artist and educator, your turn.
Well, throughout my about 50 years as an artist educator, I've sought to achieve an integrated, holistic professional life that has variously included art making, teaching, research and scholarship, curricular and program development, arts administration, and cultural advocacy. At the University of Saskatchewan from 72 to 73, I taught studio foundations, drawing and painting, supervised student teaching, mentored graduate students, and was coordinator of and studio instructor in the summer school at Emma Lake. At Acadia University, I taught large art history surveys, art education courses, studio courses, and established a course in Canadian art history. At York University, I was cross-appointed in the Faculty of Fine Arts and the Faculty of Education and taught Visual Arts Foundation, drawing, and seminars in visual art education, was the coordinator of Visual Arts in Education program and supervisor of student teaching. In addition, I was responsible for guiding MFA students in their teaching, in their student assistantships and studio investigations. At NASCAD, Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, from 1979 to 1987, I had even more comprehensive faculty administrative responsibilities that included the coordination and teaching in the first-year studio foundation courses, service as coordinator of the drawing and painting program, as well as the teaching of these disciplines from introductory to advanced levels. In addition, I taught advanced studio courses, as well as supervised numerous MFA and MA students in art education. Moreover, I was also served as the chair of the entire studio division, was president of the Faculty Association, and served on the NASCAD Board of Governors. From 87 to 88, I was executive director of the Ottawa School of Art, a community-oriented school that offered diverse courses and workshops for preschool children through secondary school levels to adult learners. Not only was I the chief administrative and academic officer, but I also developed and served as faculty in a highly accessible 3-year-long diploma program that emphasized a practical studio education as an alternative to the Ontario University and college system. In 1988, I began my appointment as professor and chair of the Department of Fine Art at the University of Guelph, where I was charged with guiding the revisions of the undergraduate programs in studio art and art history, to advocate for and encourage improvements to faculty research and professional practices, and guided the much-needed renovations of the department's facilities. I also led the development of the MFA program in studio and served as its founding coordinator. In my final year there, I coordinated and taught in the London, UK program. In 1998, I was recruited to be the first permanent vice president academic at OCAD and led the successful application for achieving degree granting status, contributed to strategic planning, and was eventually appointed for a term as president. During that period, I contributed to the interest-based negotiations that greatly improved the faculty collective agreement and had the great privilege and honor of serving on the collaborative committee that worked with the innovative architect, the brilliant Will Alsop, in the transformation of the campus. Finally, my engaged efforts as an artist educator were gratifyingly recognized by the Canadian Society of Education through Art in an invitation to present the C.D. Gaitskell Memorial Lecture at its national conference in Halifax in 2014. So
Wonderful.
That's my career as an artist educator.
Wonderful, wonderful. And now for our final question. As well-respected artists, each with impressive careers and steadfast dedication to abstraction, What words of wisdom would you like to share with the new generation of abstract painters?
In this exhibition, you have two highly contrasting careers, both formalists, but using form in salient and dissimilar ways. Yet here we are exhibiting a life's journey of work together before you. That is to say, there is no one way to become an artist. Interrogate your motivations to be an artist. Be as clear as you can about what you want from a creative life. Spend time painting. Spend time reflecting. Like any skill, artistic ability improves with practice. I think that abstract art thrives on exploration and innovation. Don't be afraid to try new techniques, materials, and styles. Experimentation can lead to unexpected discoveries and unique expressions. Like all artistic pursuits, it is about finding and developing your own voice, your visual language. Spend time understanding what resonates with you and how you can translate that into your work. Personally, I find inspiration in a lot of other artists' work. Familiarize yourself with the history and evolution of abstract art and who you are citing. The great Canadian painter Landon Mackenzie generously donated a large-scale painting to Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre in Barrie, Ontario. The surface of the work is largely covered in a pattern of small white circles, and Landon references her interest in, among other things, contemporary ideas of neurology, and specifically neuronetting and her interest in mapping, and mentions an homage to the painter Yayoi Kusama. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and you are not the first person to make art. Share your work with peers, mentors, and audiences to gain feedback. Engaging with a community of artists can provide valuable insights and help you to grow as an artist. It can open up new perspectives for you about your art. Develop resilience. Abstract art is highly subjective, and not every piece will resonate with everyone. Be prepared for criticism and rejection, and use it as an opportunity to learn and evolve. Keep an open mind and stay curious about the world around you. Follow your attention. Italian painter Giorgio Morandis has said that one can travel this world and see nothing. To achieve understanding, it is necessary not to see many things, but to look hard at what you do see. Believe in yourself, and as Jose Ortega y Gasset suggests, make a project of your life.
Wonderful, Frances. And you, Ron, what are your last parting thoughts for the emerging generation of abstract painters?
Oh, with great wisdom. Okay. Sorry. Being an artist requires a lifelong commitment to regular, disciplined work, curiosity, courage, and critical thinking as the world and the society in which one chooses to live evolves slowly or changes abruptly, as I have experienced in my lifetime. For me, visual art making is primarily a metaphoric, philosophic act and involves processes of exploration, imagination, and self-discovery, as well as a deep engagement with the observed, felt, and analyzed world. In the rigorous creation of works of art, abstraction, or representational, I believe that one must strive to make every aspect of its visual and physical characteristics contribute to its expressive integrity. My fundamental aspiration is to construct a contemplative object or thought thing, as Hannah Arendt described it, in which nothing is extraneous, and that is able to sustain attentive contemplation by a perceptive viewer through time. To do this, I've sought to be conscious of my own abilities, including the nature of my intelligence, intuitions, manual dexterity and emotional character, values, knowledge, goals, and personal aspirations in relation to the making of art. As well, I came to recognize the specific socioeconomic, political context, circumstances, and conditions that have shaped my opportunities and influences. These include the required financial means, access to necessary studio space, and the availability of materials, as well as the existence of a potentially interested audience. An awareness of relevant historical precedents and critical theories have also informed my search. Moreover, I strongly recommend being attentive to the interrelationship of every internal formal property of a work of art, including the physical materials, the context of its installation, as well as any motivating subject matter, desired meaning, or content. For more than 5 decades, I've sought to make consciously informed, abstract and non-objective paintings, drawing, prints, and wall constructions that have been formally complex and resonant in visual and material terms. From time to time, I've also drawn from observation, have been fascinated by architectural structures, and have occasionally referred to explicit emotive sources in my work. As well, it has been crucial for me to pursue a cultural continuity that seemed essential to my own temperament, curiosities, and capacities, as well as my social and economic and political realities. I am very conscious that there is no guarantee that my commitment to all the above matters will be judged as critically significant or evaluated as sufficiently original to be remembered by any empathetic audience in this troubled society with its multitude of shifting priorities. I hope these shared examples of my search for fulfillment as an artist and an educator will be useful to your own examined quest, wherever it may lead you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, this concludes our discussion. I would like to thank our exhibition sponsors, the Olga Korper Gallery, the Peter Robertson Gallery, as well as the 70 private individuals who supported this exhibition, as well as the accompanying catalog and the video. And I would like to deeply thank both Ron and Frances for this very rich, rewarding, and informative conversation. Thank you.